Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. And as always, I want to extend a very special welcome in particular to any viewers who might be tuning in from Taiwan itself for what I certainly hope is going to be a lively and very interactive discussion of two vectors. First, energy transition, and second, environmentally friendly growth, both of which touch Taiwan's long term competitiveness, but also touch the prospects for exciting new avenues of cooperation between the United States and Taiwan. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment. And, there's been over the past decade a pretty significant shift in Taiwan's attention to energy issues. For one thing, because Taiwan imports nearly all of the fuel that powers its economy, it is, of course, unusually vulnerable to energy market risks. And commodity markets, as we all know, have been buffeted by geopolitical volatility, including in recent weeks, political and investment risks, and technological disruption, too. But Taiwan also is, I think, having a pretty interesting conversation about energy because it's going to need, to be quite blunt about it, to look not just to the energy it needs right now, but also to the energy it's going to need 10 to 20 years from now to power its future. And the fact is, the number one and number two drivers of this will, in a sense, be technological change and decarbonization, not just the old drivers of cost and security. So Taiwan clearly needs to grapple with the very same challenge that faces so many other major industrial economies today, namely how to achieve decarbonization while retaining the adherence to other imperatives. Now, the good news, and I think we'll hear about this from some members of our panel, is that the government in Taiwan has set ambitious targets because it takes this seriously, including for offshore wind, for solar, for thermal, for liquefied natural gas. And Taiwan has also put in place some ambitious plans and new policies, including a more stable regulatory framework and several productive policy incentives, including feed-in tariffs. And I wrote about some of those in a report I did last year on Taiwan's energy futures that Henning and Jane, two of our panelists, participated in some workshops around. Taiwan's also set a targeted power mix of about 20% for renewables, 50% natural gas, 30% coal by 2025, although those targets seem to be shifting. And it's made some important amendments to its Electricity Act and the Renewable Energy Development Act. But of course, we all know decarbonization isn't easy anywhere. And so in 2019, for example, if I have the data right, renewables, which were supposed to be 20% of the energy mix by 2025, comprise just about 6% of Taiwan's electricity supply. And the system has come under strain as Taiwan's grid is being fitted to manage new capacity. And there are structural issues related to Taipower, which is Taiwan's state-owned electricity provider. So that's essentially what we want to talk about today. First, how decarbonization in Taiwan is going and whether the technological and financial steps Taiwan has taken in its energy transition could be any kind of model for other places around the world to emulate. And then second, we also want to talk about U.S. Taiwan and international collaborations with Taiwan around energy, environment, and climate, because there's all kinds of bipartisan support here in Washington, where I'm sitting, for more intensified partnerships with Taiwan. But even though that's bipartisan, I will say that one place where the Biden administration happens to differ from its predecessor is in its emphasis on climate change as a strategic economic and environmental priority for American policy. And so in theory, under this administration, unlike the last one, that should create fresh opportunities for American collaboration with Taiwan that didn't exist even just 18, 19, 20 months ago. So to discuss all this, I have an all-star panel of four great folks, both in Taiwan and around the world. First, we have John Liu, who works on climate change and sustainable development at National Taiwan University and is a close observer of Taiwan's pursuit of net zero carbon emissions. Next, we have Henning Gloystein, who's sitting in the UK. He directs work on energy, climate, and resources at the markets consultancy Eurasia Group, where he and his practice cover oil, gas, and renewables. Third, Jianshi Huang, also from Taiwan, from National Taiwan University. He works extensively on environmental policy in Taiwan, and interestingly, below the national level, has done a lot of work at the subnational level, which is important. And finally, my friend Jane Nakano, who's a senior fellow in energy and climate change at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, another Washington-based think tank. And she's a former senior energy official at the Department of Energy here in Washington. So guys, welcome. And John, I thought actually I'd start with you, and maybe you can help us set a little bit of a scene. I was hoping you could kick us off by just situating Taiwan's energy future in the context of its energy past and present. In other words, talk to us a little bit about Taiwan's energy and environment landscape, the key challenges you think it's facing now, what the top line policy responses look like. And then, since I know there's a lot of active policy debate now, how it's changing from where it was even just 2 or 3 years ago, and how you assess the progress on energy transition in the context of climate-related goals.
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really my honor to be here. And just like what Evan just said, I will briefly go over the general landscape on energy environment in Taiwan. So first, I will start with the carbon emission profile so that we have a general understanding of how Taiwan is doing. And Taiwan, on per capita level, Taiwan is quite high, like 11 tons per person. That's actually ranking very high in the world. And distinctly for Taiwan, the emission, half of emission comes from the industrial sector, which is much higher than the world average. And since Taiwan is an export-oriented economy, so a lot of the industry are driven by the export activity, which as Taiwan's economy is doing quite well in the past couple of years, and the emission naturally goes up. And also what's distinct about Taiwan's emission is that it's highly concentrated. It's actually a fact that's less discussed about. I think just the top 10 emitters emit almost 40% of the emission, right? And these are very hard, what we call hard to abate sectors. These are steels, petrochemical, or cement industries. So these are really tricky problems Taiwan will really tackle down the line. And just also like Evan said, Taiwan export most of the energy. Now, the number I checked is still about 6 or 7%. And now in the net zero roadmap, we're looking at not only 20% in 2025, and we're hoping to achieve 60 or 70% in 2050. And needless to say, there's a lot of challenge. Okay, so that's the general carbon emission landscape. And I will also talk about the recent policy development, because quite a lot of things happened in the past half a year. Right, first, in the end of 2021, we have a referendum, right? And 2 of the 4 referendums were energy related. And so just quickly, the result is 1 referendum basically rejects nuclear power, which has been an ongoing debate for 30 years. And Taiwanese voters again reject nuclear power in our energy mix. The other referendum basically approved to use natural gas as a bridging fuel to kind of on the way to net zero emissions. So that's kind of really important kind of referendum in the end of last year. And just in the last month, at the end of March, the Taiwanese government released our roadmap to 2050 net zero emissions. And this is quite significant because I consider this is the first comprehensive strategic planning document that's on decarbonization. Of course, there were debates, there were discussions, but this is the first time I see discussion across different ministries, and a lot of actors were mobilized to think hard about how Taiwan should achieve 2050 zero emissions. And the last development actually comes, I would say yesterday, and today is the Earth Day. So the government decided to release the draft bill of the Climate Change Response Act and the 气候变迁因应法. And this is an act, a revised bill from the earlier Climate Change Reduction and Management Act. But this new act it's much more comprehensive and also more ambitious. First of all, it puts the 2050 net zero emission in the law. So I think that's quite significant, and we've just following many other countries' steps. And second, it's the first time Taiwan is trying to instill carbon pricing in the policy. And now there's a carbon fee will be administered by EPA. It's under discussion and very likely to go online in 2024. And thirdly, I think it's very important in this act is that I think the climate governance is elevated within the government. I think there's a lot more coordination, although it still need to be improved, but there's a lot of things happening within the government to treat climate change as a really serious topic. Right, so these are key developments that happened kind of very recently. But of course, a lot of challenges are ahead. And I'll just briefly mention what I consider the toughest problem I see at this moment. It is we need to drastically increase the proportion of renewable energy in Taiwan's energy mix. But renewable energy most likely requires a lot of land. For any of you who've been to Taiwan or know Taiwan, that is something we don't have a lot. And therefore, we see a lot of land use conflict within Taiwan with renewable development, right? Solar, a lot of the solar installation will go into aquaculture, traditional farmland, in ecological sensitive areas, or even in indigenous regions. And all of these are actually happening very quickly, and we are seeing many backlashes on the land use. And people here call this green conflict, because on the one hand, you want renewables. On the other hand, you also want these green landscapes. So it's very tricky and very difficult to tackle. And I think it requires very comprehensive zoning, land use planning to overcome this. We are now at 6 or 7%, but we are aiming at 60 and 70%. You can imagine the scale of conflict that we will be most likely to see. And this is not only about solar, but as well as wind. Even a lot of these wind are offshore, but there are ecological problems or conflict with the fishing community. So that's the tough. I think that's the toughest challenge I will mention just briefly. And I know government and NGO and many actors are actively trying to deal with this. But overall, I just want to say one thing. I see climate change. I've been following this for more than 10 years. Climate change and green economy was really on the margin of public discussion for a long time. No one cares about this. But really, it's in the last 2 years. If you come to Taiwan, you see all these business magazines. A lot of the cover story is about carbon. It's about energy. And I think there are two main drivers on this. The number one, there's a lot of pressure coming from the supply chain. When Apple announced they're going carbon neutral, all the Taiwanese suppliers feel the pressure and feel like, oh, this is quite serious. We need to take this. They need to take this seriously. And number two is, as I said, Taiwan is export-oriented economy, and the European Union tried to launch the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment, basically a carbon tariff, and that also drives a lot of Taiwanese industry kind of on guard. Say, oh, we need to take care of this, otherwise we'll lose our advantage globally, right? So these are kind of the general picture. I'll stop here and really look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, John, that was great. Can I just push you on the politics for a second?
Sure.
Before I go to Henning? I mean, it strikes me, one thing that strikes me about energy transition and climate stuff everywhere is that in a lot of places, it's not an intellectual problem. It's a political problem, but that the politics of that varies from place to place. I mean, here in the United States, as Jane knows, the configuration of the political problem isn't exactly the way you described it in Taiwan. You described it as green on green, which suggests, broadly speaking, there's a political consensus. Mm-hmm. It's just a question of, it's an operational question of execution as you bump up against things like land use policies and land rights. Here, at least in some communities, it's more existential. The politics of climate change is a little bit different. There isn't a consensus. on nature of the problem, the nature of the solutions. So would you argue that in Taiwan's case, there is broad-based consensus across the political spectrum, notwithstanding, and this is why I raised this question, the fact that in those referendums, they were extremely partisan, right? The opposition party, the Kuomintang, decided to make that kind of a political and electoral test of strength,
Right.
even around something like a liquefied natural, like an LNG terminal on the coast.
Yes.
Is that purely political, or does it reflect a lack of consensus as you have in some other places?
I think overall, in terms of climate change, I think that's something Taiwan is fortunate that we don't. It's a broad consensus in terms of the nature of climate change as a problem. We have very few climate skeptics or denialists in Taiwan, and which most people recognize the problem. But I think for a long time, the major division is on the attitude towards nuclear. Right, as you know, DPP starts the party from the very beginning is anti-nuclear. But for a long time, KMT is pro-nuclear. So that has been the major debate, which is occupied too much of people's time, in my opinion, but in the last 20, 30 years. And therefore, we had another referendum last year. And so I think that's a major division. But besides that, I think there's a broad-based support on, yes, we need to take climate change seriously. We need to reinvent our economy to pursue kind of the green competition in the world, right? So,
right.
Yes.
Okay, good. So, Ginger, I want to come back to, when I come to you, I want to come back to that, because if there's a national level consensus, then the implementation and execution problem really going to play out at the local level. And I know you've looked at that a lot. But I do want to go to Henning first, because now that John's given us a picture of Taiwan's build out, I'm hoping you can situate Taiwan in a bit of a comparative context as well. I mean, I know you're a close student of energy and environmental developments in Taiwan, but you cover the region writ large as well, and actually the global situation. So how's Taiwan faring in comparative terms? And where do you see both the obstacles and the opportunities in a technology and competitive sense, not just in an environmental and climate related sense? How do you assess the state of things at this point?
Thanks, Evan. And I'm actually not the great Taiwan expert here, so it was very interesting to listen to John there. So, I mean, Taiwan's energy supply has been, tricky commercially and geopolitically for the last decades, and sadly, of course, 2022 is not going to make that easier. The problem is, and it's far away from Taiwan, but it's of course the war in Ukraine. What's happening is, because the European Union now must, whether it wants to or not, but it must and will decouple itself from Russian oil, gas, and coal imports as fast as possible and by as much as possible. It means that they will tap the international oil and gas markets pretty much imminently. They already are. And drive up prices. This is why LNG prices have gone through the roof. This is why coal price has gone up. And this is contributing to the oil price being above $100 per barrel. Because basically, unless you're still willing to buy Russian oil, which you can still do at $70 a barrel, you'll have to pay $110 per barrel if it's non-Russian. And it's pretty much the same for gas. And that is the problem for the LNG market. And so just to put this into context, the European Union plans this year alone to add 10% to global LNG demand. That's their plan. That's what they're putting the tenders out for. And that means that the global LNG industry must operate without a fault throughout this year to ensure supply. And that will be felt in Northeast Asia and in Taiwan. And this is a bit of a problem, because what this means is, for the next few years, because this problem won't be solved just this year, the European Union will have to do that next year in 2024 as well, until other forms are fully available. So that means that the LNG price, and probably oil as well, will be pretty high for a while. And this means operational costs, OPEX, for oil, gas, and coal globally will be high this year, next, and maybe 2024. On top of that, capex costs are going through the roof, because the Europeans are having to build new LNG import terminals. They're having to build all the green transition stuff. And especially in the LNG sector, that is actually causing and will cause labor shortages, and it'll drive prices up. It'll cause delays in the supply chain. And on top of that, a lot of this capex will be borrowed money, and the cost of lending is increasing as well, because interest rates are rising across the world. And this means that the entire energy complex, price complex, is surging. We might not see the record prices of $150 oil as we saw a bit earlier this year, or gas, LNG at $55 per MMBTU. Even if we don't, though, the general cost will be high for a while. And this is a problem for Taiwan because, as Evan, you mentioned, Taiwan has to import every molecule that it has. And so that means that this problem, this conflict in Europe, is affecting Taiwan and all of the rest of the world as well. And that, of course, means what do you do about the green energy transition? And how do you secure supply before you get to this transition? And this is where something is starting to pop up now, and we started calling it supply chain diplomacy. You're seeing things like, again, it started with the EU and US starting to do this LNG deal, and then Qatar received US accreditation as a major non-NATO ally. The Japanese suddenly started saying, well, maybe we can give some spare LNG to Europe, and so forth. So we will see this in Asia as well. If Australia can spare molecules with strategic partners and allies, including Taiwan, it will maybe do so that to find ways that LNG, gas, oil remains affordable without becoming prohibitively expensive, while also ensuring the seller a decent price. This is all not new. I mean, this has happened in the past, but the suddenness of this trend is pretty brutal. And we will see, though, and this is where we come to the green transition, and I think US support here will be important, is you will see new supply chains being built, and Taiwan will need to, and will, I think, play an important role here, and that is the establishment of global hydrogen and ammonia supply chains. In order to support intermittent renewables, whether they're offshore wind or solar, doesn't matter. Hydrogen works. Hydrogen works as a fertilizer for ammonia, as a feedstock. It works in steel production. It works as a heating fuel. So in transportation, it works as well. The problem is there is no international market for this yet. So we know the stuff works, but we don't know how to get it from Australia to Taiwan, or from the United States to Taiwan. And this is where collaboration is starting to emerge, and it's emerging really fast. We work in this a fair bit. It started again with the emergence of the EU, and COVID money started plopping up to say, okay, let's build hydrogen supply chains. The Japanese started, and then they got the Australians on board. Now the US is involved with the methane pledge as well. That helped. And in Asia, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, almost in the neighborhood of Taiwan, they're all getting involved in this. And they have to, because what will need to happen to make this green transition important and to work is for these global supply chains to work, so that you can get hydrogen and liquid ammonia from North America to Asia, from Australia to Asia, from the Middle East to Europe, and do a portfolio game. The problem is this will have to happen in the next, 5 to 10 years. And in the LNG industry, it took, 30 years. So, and this is the problem. The good news is that the money and the political will is there. The capital is there. Most international finances, banks, pension funds, they have money. Governments are spending on this. And there are a lot of diplomatic initiatives among strategic allies, including the United States, of course, crucially. But also countries with, you have good trade relations, Japan, EU, Australia. They're all working together this because it is a joint need and a necessity, but it is also commercial opportunity. And I want to stress that, because it might all seem terribly challenging right now and hugely expensive, which both is true. But in long term, we're quite convinced that there's political and economic and environmental benefits in this. And I do actually think Taiwan will play a crucial role in this, as it did indeed in the LNG industry over the last 3 decades. I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Can I push you on that, though? Do you think Taiwan is flexible and risk tolerant enough to make those kinds of investments? I mean, if I think about LNG in Taiwan, right, 98% of the natural gas they use must come in the form of LNG. And if I'm not mistaken, pretty much all of that comes from just 3 countries, right? It's Australia, it's Malaysia, it's Qatar. And all of that is based on long-term contracts. There's not a lot of spot pricing because Taiwan has tended to prefer the predictability and the comparative stability of long-term contracts. So since you have all these new pricing methods and ways of acquiring LNG that have emerged, my impression has been that Taiwan's had a lot of potential to be much more flexible and risk tolerant on, for example, spot pricing, but that's not been their preference. And so if that suggests something about their approach to energy markets generally, does that suggest they need to be much more risk tolerant in other areas as well?
I mean, some of it I'll have to pass on to people from Taiwan, but so I mean, for starters, in the LNG industry, for instance, the last 5 years looked much better if you were spot market reliant, whereas now it looks far better if you are long-term oil index reliant,
Yeah,
because the
that's
spot price has gone
right.
literally through the roof. So this risk averseness, for once, is
It's
paying
paying
off
off.
in the case of
Yeah,
Taiwan.
yeah.
If you look at hydrogen and future hydrogen and liquid ammonia supply chains, in fact, you will see probably something similar. The suppliers are similar. The Australians will be big players in this. They want long-term contracts to be signed initially, maybe not in 20 years, but now, because they need the long-term income to finance building this export infrastructure. Malaysia is the same thing. They want to get into this. North America, the US, Canada, both involved. And in the Middle East, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, they're all looking at this. So actually, I think this would probably be a good moment for Taiwan to engage in this industry on the basis of signing long-term contracts. And if in a few years' time somebody wants to get involved in the spot market for these future markets, then for sure that'll be welcome. But I think at the moment, these sort of foundational clients like Taiwan would be quite welcome to the folks who are developing this export industry.
Right, that makes sense. So, Jensha, let's turn to you. Um, John said kind of a national scene, and I know you think about a pretty broad range of actors in Taiwan in your work. So, putting aside the climate imperative, because I mean, I think we're all convinced there's a climate imperative in Taiwan. It's broadly felt, it's broadly shared. What does the execution landscape look like once you get below the level of the national government in Taipei, target setting, policy reforms? How's execution going? How invested are local governments, local communities in that? And then also situate for us industry and and other stakeholders in Taiwan's policy landscape.
Okay. Yeah, first, thanks for inviting me to this discussion. And so I will briefly discuss about the kind of the process of policy implementation in Taiwan, especially at the local level. And I think it's always good for us or for the government to try to define the policy problem, right? And also try to propose some solution and set up some policy goals. But it's important to know how policy can be implemented. So here, I think there are probably two major challenges in Taiwan as a local level to implement the energy policy. So the first issue, as John mentioned, in Taiwan, right, the side conflict, it's kind of a controversial issue. I think it's not just only for Taiwan, but also for a lot of area around the world, right? So basically, the local community may not always support the policy decision made by the central government. It's mainly because they have different viewpoints. For the kind of local community, right, they might resistant to policy proposal made by a national government, mainly because they have their own unique concern about local resources or local contact. On the other hand, the regional actor or the central government may take care more about the kind of the balanced regional development and also the collective interests. So it's possible, right, the national government try to propose some renewable energy project which will make specific local community need to bear most of the costs for the diffuse policy benefit. So for example, in Zhanghua, right, the fishermen will try to protest the offshore wind farm. And that mainly because they concern about the marine ecology and resources. And also we can find there are a lot of similar cases in agricultural area as well as the development of solar PV installation. So basically what I want to highlight is that the government definitely need to do more work on policy communication and coordination across, within or with different policy stakeholder across geographic scale. And the second challenging is that even for some local community, they are willing to engage in energy transition process, they may also need to overcome administrative burden, which means for local resident and business in Kaohsiung, as some study illustrate, if they want to apply for solar PV installation, especially for the rooftop one, then they must have to learn how to prepare the paperwork for the permission of PV system construction. And then they also need to do a lot of things to comply with the building code, so that this kind of installation can be a legal one, right? And more importantly, for this local community, they may encounter some financial problem, especially the upfront cost for solar PV is quite high. But without sufficient institutional support, the bank may not be willing to provide a loan for local community or the resident. And right now, there are some civic group try to do some kind of the community renewable project. And this project can be initiated by an NGO or some crowdsourcing resources. But again, right, because of the legal restriction, so they may not be easily to get some financial support from the bank, so that they need to pay the upfront cost. And all of this could slow down the process of energy transition, and it could make the Taiwan need to address the mounting environmental or energy challenging at the time, right? That being said, we still can find that there are some potential opportunity for speeding up the energy transition, especially for some local government. They try to collaborate with some high-tech industry, especially they try to build a virtual power plant in the public building, especially in the public school, either elementary school or the high school, right? So all these kind of things can show that some local government are really ambitious to collaborate with a wide range of policy stakeholders to kind of integrate different interests and try to use different policy tools so that they can deal with these in energy and environmental challenges.
So can you highlight a success case? I mean, I know you've looked at cases all over Taiwan. So pick out one or two and tell us what a success case looks like, whether it's rooftop solar or it's PV installation, whatever it is. What were the key ingredients to make it work?
As far as I know, based on my limited knowledge, one of the success case would be the Taoyuan local government collaborate with the Wenxing Elementary School. So basically, this is a kind of the startup company which used to doing some work in Japan, and then they collaborate with the help of from the Taoyuan local municipal government, and then they try to help the elementary school build a solar system and using some AI technique to monitor how the usage of the electricity and try to distribute the power in different time periods so that they can make the usage of utility more efficient, and also it's possible for the elementary school to sell the kind of surplus to the national run company for the industry, for the utility.
Okay, thanks. Makes sense. All right, Jane. So I want to pull the United States into this a little bit because it's a big investor in Taiwan. It's a good partner to Taiwan. So about a month ago, I testified to the House Foreign Affairs Committee at a briefing session on the new Indo-Pacific economic framework that the administration keeps promising that they're going to roll out. And I testified with Wendy Cutler and a few other, and my number one takeaway from this hearing was, boy, does the House Foreign Affairs Committee love Taiwan on a bipartisan basis. Democrats, Republicans, they all kept talking about Taiwan. All right, so for this administration, which has made both climate diplomacy and energy transition an important part of its strategic priorities for foreign policy, economic policy, investment policy, innovation policy, logically, Taiwan ought to fit into that, in or out of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Tell me how you think Taiwan fits into current U.S. thinking, government thinking, policy thinking, strategic thinking about climate and energy transition as a diplomatic and commercial and technological imperative. But then also flip it, not just how Taiwan fits into that, but how that ought to fit into U.S.-Taiwan partnerships as people look to find creative ways to expand the partnership, particularly given some of the political constraints.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me, Evan. Climate is, as you said, is really the top priority for the Biden administration. And it's not that our energy access and energy security have become less important, but I think climate is now sort of the organizing principle, that really, shapes the contour of policy making regarding, even low carbon technologies as opposed to low tech, and energy security and resource diplomacy issues. And this Indo-Pacific economic framework is this vehicle, and it has it talks about a lot of climate and energy agenda. I think mainly under two themes, the regional prosperity theme, and then also the resilience theme. And these really include a lot of things that to some extent have been really bipartisan, things like making standard shared investments in decarbonization and clean energy, also advancing resilient and secure supply chains. There's also a discussion on helping the region become more resilient to the climate change induced events, but then also environmental degradation. But I actually do already see key areas where the United States and Taiwan have strong alignment. First and foremost, as John has already mentioned a bit, there's a mid-century net neutral commitment that both Washington and Taipei take very seriously. But then also there's the commitment to expanding renewables. Of course, it hasn't been easy in Taiwan, but then also it hasn't been that easy in the United States either, for one reason or another. But there is a focused approach, and also there is an understanding that this I think diversified mix of power sources really increases energy security, but as well as sort of a climate security for both, and as well as all the regional economies. And then, of course, this hasn't come up as much this morning, but I think grid resilience. I think actually, Evan, you mentioned that in the opening, but all these, whether it's renewable related or not, grid system needs to be resilient. Whether it's for more climate and weather induced events, or whether it's to anticipate certain national security or geopolitically motivated disruptions. And I think the sense of urgency has risen a bit, certainly in the United States, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the need has been there. And now, I guess quickly going into areas where I do see growing synergy. I'm actually glad, and maybe not as glad, because Henning nicely was very articulate about how hydrogen could be area for greater cooperation. That's exactly what I wanted to spend a little more time talking about. As John said, I think industrial sector is one of the more energy consuming, but then also it's the greenhouse gas emitting sectors, and the hydrogen and is an extremely viable tool, as a lot of economies, whether you're export oriented or not, but manufacturing and certainly in export oriented economies strive to decarbonize harder to abate sectors. But Taiwan already has fuel cell technologies. It's known for that. Also, there, from my, based on my, some literature survey, there are a lot of hydrogen production technology innovation, research and innovation that's been going on. And now that the United States is, refocused on hydrogen And as we see, the Department of Energy starting to formulate or actually establish this hydrogen hub, thanks to $8 billion plus coming from the Infrastructure, Infrastructure and Jobs Act. I think there's greater momentum, and I think that really, so hydrogen will be one of the areas for greater collaboration. The other one and then in many ways, this is where, how Taiwan may fit in what the United States is trying to do, but it's a really, area for bilateral collaboration that actually has a lot of implications for the regional security, not just energy security, but then also sort of climate security. The other piece I wanted to quickly mention is critical mineral supply chains, so clean energy supply chain issues. I think a few of my colleagues this morning have already mentioned this, and as Henning said, this oil gas market volatility and price rise, especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I think these, the markets have been quite, acting up, if you will, since before the invasion. But the other area where we're seeing the sense of urgency become higher since the invasion is the critical mineral prices and the secure access to these minerals that are key to clean energy technologies and their deployment. Things, and it's not, and I'm not suggesting that we'll be doing joint mining, if you will, but the supply chain is complex, it's global, and given, Taiwan's expertise in, mid to downstream in this clean energy supply chains, and now that the U.S. is more focused on, reactivating upstream, but then also enforcing the midstream capacities, I think this is another area where we could be having much more focused discussion, not just vaguely. And just to add, I don't think the right way is to sort of make this into either or, that the supply chain, our partners in the Indo-Pacific need to join the U.S. team versus others. I think we need much more robust and diversified supply chains, that all the economies that are dependent on these minerals, but then also subsequent components and equipment can rely on with more transparent market signals. And I think for that reason, I think Taiwan will continue to be our partner, and I think there's even greater scope. Thanks so much.
But what's the right vehicle for that? Is it kind of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or is it a network of interlocking supply chain agreements in the private sector? What does that look like?
I think actually public-private will be an important element to any engagement we will end up having. Just because in a way, I think the U.S. policy has been for the last decades, 2, 3, or even 4 decades, our approach to critical mineral supply chains have been much more national security focused, more but needs to the ability to meet the defense industry and national security requirements. But now that the civilian side, clean energy technology side of demand is extremely dynamic, and it's just growing so rapidly. Government players or the policymakers need to really work much more closely with private industry stakeholders, because they're really driving, the technology innovation, but then a lot of exchange on things like even permitting, the mining permits, certainly in the United States. But then I think the supply chain is so complex that we really need to be having robust discussion between the public and private stakeholders, but then a lot of different stakeholders. And as far as the vehicles go, it's something I don't know to what extent, but maybe like APEC, maybe one area, one vehicle, where there could be even more robust look at these issues. And I know that of course, Taiwan is not part of Quad. I mean, Quad already has the working group that tries to look at these issues. But it could. My desire is to see as much of engagement with private sector stakeholders in the region together with policymakers.
Okay, so if I pull that thread, maybe this is for John and Henning. How internationalized in comparative terms do you think the relevant sectors are in Taiwan? Right, there's what I've noticed about Taiwan's economy, and having done work on it over the years, there are some sectors that are very internationalized. Hardware, right? Semiconductors, chipsets, lots of people flow, lots of technology flow. Taiwan is a global standard setter because it is such a huge part of the global market. So it's able to basically export and scale its indigenous engineering standards, and they become default standards around the world. There are a lot of sectors where Taiwan is really not that internationalized, either because it's not as open to investment, or it doesn't have the scale. It's only got 24 million people. Sectors where you see a lot of startup companies are not that international because they've catered mostly to the domestic market. How internationalized, not just internationalized, do you think the relevant players are? And how much do you think the regulatory environment in Taiwan needs to shift, to the extent it hasn't already, to make Taiwan more of a global player? And that's for either of you.
And you want to go first?
All right, I can very briefly say, so CPC is well established in a global LNG market, in fact, extremely well, and has, I can say that without any vested interest, has a very good standing with suppliers. And a lot of these suppliers will also be future suppliers of the hydrogen liquid ammonia that we've been talking about. So I think that should be quite a doable operation and project within the context of the challenges and the costs that this will come with. So I think in that space there's a lot of goodwill. And very briefly, to something that John said earlier with the CBAM in Europe, the carbon border adjustment mechanism that looms as a threat over many places. There's a few things I think for Taiwan to consider that this won't be a big issue for future, because the first is by simply announcing a carbon price domestically, a lot of this pressure will be gone. So any counterpart of the EU that says we're going to do something on carbon pricing has basically taken that sting out. This is why we saw Indonesia probably introduce something like that. The next one is, if a counterparty collaborates in establishing future green energy supply chains, that argument is already out of the table as well. And the last one is, because the EU is driving up fossil fuel prices for any other energy import-reliant place on Earth at this stage, including Taiwan, of course, they can't then go to that same place and then introduce another cost on them by CBAM, because this urgency in Europe is driving up prices for LNG, coal, and oil also for Taiwan. So on that one, I think that the CBAM threat for Taiwan is currently a non-issue. That's part of the little good news. And I think CPC has a good standing in international energy supply chains.
China Petroleum, yeah. John?
Yeah, my sense is that for key technologies such as maybe fuel cell, energy storage, if it's related to the electronic industry, I think they are very globally integrated. I mean, they are part of this kind of the electronic industry, so I wouldn't worry so much about that. And yeah, but then they also feel the pressure the fastest when there is something in the supply chain. They're very quickly to respond.
Right. Ginger, you want to talk about public-private partnerships a little bit? I'd be curious. Industry actors, university actors, other actors in Taiwan, what would successful or not so successful partnerships look like to help build out this energy future?
I think right now, just like a lot of local government in the United States, the Taiwan local government try to push some energy project within the public building first, rather than just go community first things. If they try to implement the project within the community, they may encounter a lot of controversy, as I and John mentioned, in Taiwan political context. So At this moment, it would be easier for municipal government try to either provide some, as far as I know, provide some subsidy, right, to help the industry to lower their costs to collaborate with public school so that they can have some possibility to install the system or try to, and also it could be a kind of incentive for public school to do this kind of smart system so that they can save some costs, since right now they may encounter some challenging, since there are a few children who enroll in the public school. So, yeah.
What are the on the policy side, are there kind of 2 or 3 top, if you had a wish list, what are kind of the 2 or 3 top policy reforms that you think haven't been undertaken that would need to be undertaken to facilitate of getting over the obstacles that you've seen, especially at the local level?
I think probably the most important thing would be they need to try to reduce some administrative burden, such as probably simplify the application process and then do more kind of coordination with the central government, how to kind of get rid of some complicated or contradicted standard for the building code, something like that. So I think that would be the kind of important issue the municipal government as well as the central government need to deal with.
So administrative reform around things like building codes. Yeah, no, I get that.
Can I also jump in on the policies prescription? Yeah. I think for the policy, one thing we haven't talked too much about is on the demand side. So far on the energy. So far we talked about how we get energy, but for the demand side, whether Taiwan should use so much energy in the first place. And just so you know, Taiwan is one of the lowest electricity and oil price in the world. I just checked. The oil price here is lower than Washington, D.C., which doesn't make much sense to me that we're not an oil producer, right? So, but it's a tricky political issue, and Taiwan has been relying on this low utility price kind of environment for industry development for a long time. And people are very used to this, and people are not really aware where the energy comes from. So I think just like Evan mentioned, energy security earlier on, I think the global disruption will I hope that force Taiwan to really rethink on the energy kind of electricity pricing and oil pricing, etc., because they are all heavily subsidized. They are all nationally owned and heavily subsidized, right? And that needs to be addressed. But it's a kind of tricky thing that usually you lose votes when dealing with that.
Yeah, I was gonna add, what is the political imperative for that? Anywhere.
Yeah, so I think it will have to come from some outside shock that if the Ukraine-Russia conflict really drive up the price and energy price, etc., and there's a kind of more legit reason that we are moving forward on this, and it needs a kind of political opportunity, window of political opportunity, and it might be now or kind of soon because people are now taking this seriously.
Are there people in Taiwan's political debate who've staked out ground where they view that as a potential electoral winner, or is it just universal?
Not a winner, but if you survey people, is the electricity price are too low, and do you agree to raise electricity price? People actually, there's some support, but we have to, of course, take a grain of salt with how much we read into these polls. But the utility price is very cheap. Oil price too low for kind of just as a non-oil producing country.
You can also subsidize or at least incentivize measures to reduce demand, like subsidize ripping out your gas boiler or subsidize electric vehicle rollout. This is something that we're quite actively seeing in Europe right now, but out of urgency as much as.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Just quickly, pretty early on in this conflict, Fatih Birol, who's head of International Energy Agency, did talk about the importance of conservation. and as as John also, talked about how, some economies probably have more room to be able to, conserve rather than, to some extent, I think trying to subsidize and then even reduce the fuel tax. But unfortunately, I think, there's greater political motivation to go with the second, option. And we've already seen, a few European countries try to do that. And I think some others in Asia are also trying to do that. But I think going forward, I mean, again, that's in conservation efficiency are the lowest hanging fruit. And if this doesn't really give us the momentum to do it, it's just such a shame. This should be an opportunity as opposed to, time to reinforce our bad habit, if you will.
Yeah. And that's a point Taiwan had to really kind of more domestic issue. I want to also jump in on the U.S.-Taiwan cooperation
Please.
side. And I really echo earlier points on hydrogen. I think hydrogen featured heavily in the 2050 roadmap. And I think Taiwan expect we need to use hydrogen because there's no way we can only depend on our own renewable energy. So there is expectation we need to import some of the hydrogen. Exactly how we need to figure out, and I think it's really important that Taiwan and U.S. build robust partnership on this key technology, as well as CCUS, the carbon capture technology. Just today, I saw earlier there's a news that some Taiwanese major company, China Steel, Plastic, and they signed an MOU with, GE, ExxonMobil to kind of co-develop this CCUS technology. And these are all positive development. I think there's in any of these key new green technology, we should deepen. I wish we can deepen the technological cooperation. And even the more traditional, I think solar, right? In the solar supply chain, there's a debate on the China solar panel there's human rights issue with this. I think as we see the disruption in global supply chain, and I think Taiwanese manufacturers might be there's some role, maybe a stronger role to play here too.
Yeah, but the issue there is where the polysilicon comes from, right?
Yeah.
From panels. So you'd have to source it somewhere else.
Right.
There's no easy fix to that.
No.
Yeah. Are you so this is kind of I know we're coming up on time, but it's interesting. Jane and Henning answered the last question by pointing to European models for Taiwan. And I'm always pushing at this idea that maybe Taiwan is developing models, industry models, public-private partnership models, technology, innovation and deployment models that actually can be exported and scaled internationally, notwithstanding the small scale of the Taiwan market. Are there things you see, any of you, happening in Taiwan that you think could be a model for other economies that are wrestling with some of the same issues, whether it's energy transition or it's the demand side emissions problem?
Yeah, I actually prepared a comment just for this question. So
Great, I'm glad
I think the model isn't so much about technology. It's more about values and democracy. I think this is key. I mean, especially working with Biden administration, we use a lot of democratic innovations in climate governance. I mean, open data governance and kind of local public participation, etc. It's not perfect, but I think it's important Taiwan do this in a very democratic way, so that we reject the idea that environmental authoritarianism is a better way to fight with climate change. And I think, and Taiwan, the government talks a lot about just transition, that we need to kind of focus on social justice in all of these, kind of pursuing a global new economy. That again also relates to kind of Biden's imperative on addressing environmental injustice in the United States. And there's a lot of places that we can work together. For example, Formosa Plastic actually has a huge operation in Louisiana and kind of damaging in the Cancer Valley. And it's deeply connected. And I think in terms of model, I want to emphasize not so much on the technology side, but also on the value and kind of democratic model that Taiwan's, especially our Tsai administration cherishes a lot. Talks and try to work on.
Okay, Jennifer, same question for you. Are there things you're seeing in Taiwan that you think could be models?
I think I agree with John's argument, since, as I mentioned, there are lots of civic participation especially at the local level, although there are some barrier on administrative procedure or burden. And that's also the reason I argue it's the most important step the local or municipal government need to take in order to kind of fasten the process of energy transition.
Great. Okay, Henning and then Jane, last words to you two.
Yeah, very much. I mean, I kind of agree there. Sort of public participation, if you're in a democracy, it's hugely important. We all use and consume energy, so and Taiwan is a highly industrialized economy, so it needs reliable and affordable electricity and energy. So how to do that is an important aspect to involve the public in, and not all countries do this. So I think that's important. But I think technology and innovation are absolutely key here as well. And Taiwan, I mean, not just in the energy sector, pretty much everywhere else, has been pretty much of a lead role there, where I think a lot of societies, countries, and companies or governments can take a close look at and say how they did it.
Okay, and Jane, last word to you.
Yeah, I agree with everything that the three colleagues have said. I mean, whether it's technology or even some of the market issues, rulemaking is an area where, there's so much that we can work together, and it doesn't necessarily take certain, intergovernmental bodies, right? There's so much that we actually have to get started, whether it's hydrogen market creation or even, some of the alternative clean energy technologies where we might be able to become much more competitive vis-a-vis, existing dominant players, for example. So thanks.
Great. Well, I know we're at time, and I appreciate y'all doing this. I think, personally, I think this area is only going to continue to grow in salience, both for Taiwan and for Taiwan's international partnerships, including with the U.S. So I'm struck by a lot of the points that came out, especially the ones that are prescriptive, but also just the underlying analysis, because on the demand side, it's obviously imperative that we take climate change seriously, and Taiwan is doing that. And there's political consensus, as John pointed out, around that, and that could lead to demand side reforms and changes. Then there's the question of Taiwan's open system, which creates a foundation of trust, and trust in a way can be a comparative advantage, not least in attracting international partnerships. And then, as Henning just stressed, there's the supply side, there's the technology piece, and Taiwan is, as he said, a high performing economy, but also an innovative economy. So it's one that's surfed a lot of waves of technological change in the past in all sorts of sectors: manufacturing, healthcare, agriculture. So it just does seem to me, even though John cautioned us not to only talk about technology, that at least positions Taiwan well to adapt to the changes that are reshaping a whole bunch of energy industries. So those pillars, technology and markets, as well as the idea of open government as a basis for political consensus, are keystones. And so they can help Taiwan overcome energy challenges, but also create a platform for international partnerships to define Taiwan's energy and climate future as part of a shared energy and climate future as well. So I appreciate you all doing this. Thanks for making time. We appreciate the audience tuning in. This is going to live on YouTube and on the Carnegie website forever. So even if people didn't tune in today, they'll tune in next week, next month, and beyond. And as I said, the issue will only grow in salience. So thanks, team, for joining us. Much obliged to you all. And thanks to the audience. And again, good morning and good evening to you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.